Florida's known for sunshine, beaches, and some of the darkest crimes in American history. But what if I told you that behind some of the state's most chilling murder cases weren't masked men or serial predators, but women? Cold, calculated, and completely unexpected. These aren't just isolated crimes. They shocked entire communities, made national headlines, and in some cases, changed how we look at evil itself. From a mother who tortured her own child, to a viral internet star turned killer, and a woman who zipped her boyfriend into a suitcase and pressed record. These are the most evil female killers who terrorized Florida. And before we dive in, I want to know, do you think women are capable of the same kind of darkness as men when it comes to murder? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if true crime stories that go beyond the headlines are your thing, hit subscribe and turn on that bell, because this story gets deeper with every name. Ana Maria Cardona, nickname Baby Lollipops Killer, on the morning of November 2, 1990, in a quiet residential area of Miami Beach, a groundskeeper working in front of an abandoned house made a horrifying discovery. Lying beneath a tree, half hidden in the grass, was the body of a young child. He was thin, dangerously emaciated, with bruises scattered across his small frame. His face was battered beyond recognition, and his tiny form bore signs of prolonged suffering. The child had no identification. No one came forward to claim him. All investigators had to go on was the T-shirt he wore. It read, Lollipops, written in pastel-colored letters. That would become his name in the public eye, Baby Lollipops. For days, authorities worked through missing persons lists and media broadcasts, hoping someone would recognize the boy. When they finally did, the truth that unraveled was more disturbing than anyone expected. The boy's name was Lázaro Figueroa. He was only 3 years old. His mother, Ana Maria Cardona, was soon identified and arrested. To those who knew her casually, Ana appeared like many struggling mothers. She was young, attractive, and known to be lively at parties. A woman trying to piece her life together after hardship. But beneath the surface, her life was unraveling, and her child had paid the price. Ana had once lived comfortably. Her late partner, Lázaro's father, had been a drug dealer, one with enough wealth to keep Ana in luxury. But when he was killed in a drug-related dispute, the lifestyle she had grown used to disappeared. So did her sense of stability. Friends noted a shift in her behavior, anger, instability, and bursts of cruelty, particularly toward her children. After her partner's death, Ana reportedly began using substances heavily. She moved in with a new girlfriend, Veronica Gonzales, and together the two spiraled deeper into dysfunction. Authorities would later uncover that Lázaro had been taken out of school. Neighbors said they rarely saw him outside, and when they did, he was quiet, withdrawn, and appeared underweight. It took the autopsy to reveal the full scope of what had happened. Lázaro's body showed signs of long-term abuse. He had suffered blunt force injuries, burns and fractured bones, some in various stages of healing. He was starved, weighing less than 20 pounds at the time of his death. He had been, in the words of the coroner, systematically broken down. The horror was not just in the violence, but in how prolonged and deliberate it had been. When Ana was confronted, her story shifted. First, she blamed her girlfriend, then strangers. At one point, she claimed Lázaro had simply fallen, but investigators found evidence in the home, blood traces, broken objects, and a pattern of neglect that aligned with what had been done to the boy. Ana Maria Cardona was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. In 1992, she became the first woman in Florida to be sentenced to death in over a decade. But the legal process was far from over. Years later, her conviction was overturned on appeal. In 2010, she was retried. The jury again sentenced her to death. But after a second appeal, in 2017, the court ruled that certain testimony had been improperly introduced. A third trial followed. This time, rather than pursue the death penalty, prosecutors sought life in prison, and that's what she received. The motive was never as simple as rage. It was a mix of grief, resentment, and unchecked cruelty. Some speculated that Ana saw her son as a burden, a reminder of a life she had lost. Others suggested that without her former lifestyle and support, she projected her pain onto the most defenseless person around her. But in the end, no explanation feels adequate. The image of Lazaro, a child whose name had to be guessed from his shirt, stayed with the public for decades. The press called him Baby Lollipops, but beneath that nickname was a boy who never had a chance to grow up. He was denied safety, nourishment, and love. His case became a symbol of both failure and outrage, failure of those who could have intervened, and outrage at the person who should have protected him most. Today, Ana Maria Cardona remains behind bars, serving a life sentence without parole. There's no comfort in this case, no redemptive, in arc or simple resolution. Just a reminder, the worst kinds of harm don't always come from strangers. Sometimes they come from within a home. And in Lazaro's case, from the person he trusted most. His grave now bears his name, and while justice may have taken decades to stabilize, his story still haunts those who remember it, and perhaps it should. Tiffany Cole. On July 10, 2005, in the quiet suburb of Jacksonville, Florida, a friend of Reggie and Carol Sumner knocked on their front door. But no one answered. That alone was alarming. The elderly couple, both in their late 60s, were known for their predictable routine. They didn't travel, they didn't miss appointments, and they always called back. But that weekend, their phones were silent. When police entered the home later that evening, what they found immediately raised suspicion. The house was tidy, no sign of forced entry, no blood, no struggle. But the couple's beds were empty, their medications untouched, and their car was missing. Even more chilling, the garage door was open, and the home smelled faintly of bleach. The Sumners had vanished. Reggie and Carol had moved to Florida for a fresh start. Both had endured health setbacks, and both had children from previous marriages. But they found peace in each other. Neighbors described them as kind and soft-spoken, the kind of couple who waved from the porch and volunteered at church. They had downsized their life, settling into a modest home and trusting the world around them. Among those they trusted was a young woman named Tiffany Cole. Publicly, Tiffany seemed ordinary. She had a friendly smile, a quiet demeanor, and a past that included little more than minor legal troubles. She'd met the Sumners through her father. They had been neighbors once in South Carolina. When Tiffany later moved to Florida, she stayed in touch. The Sumners even sold her a car, extending her a loan and trusting her to pay it off over time. But behind that polite exterior, Tiffany's life was shifting. She'd begun dating a man named Michael Jackson, not the celebrity, but a man with a criminal past and a growing appetite for fast money. Together, they devised a plan rooted in betrayal. Tiffany knew that the Sumners were comfortable, if not wealthy. She knew they paid their bills on time, had little debt, and likely kept some savings. But more importantly, she knew where they lived. She knew their schedule, and she had their trust. On the night of July 8, 2005, Tiffany and three accomplices, Michael Jackson, Bruce Nixon, and Alan Wade, entered the Sumners' home while the couple was sleeping. They tied them up, gagged them, and forced them into the trunk of their own car. From there, they were driven across state lines into Georgia, over an hour away. At some point during that drive, Reggie and Carol must have realized what was happening. They were still alive when the group dug a shallow grave in a remote wooded area, still bound, still gagged, and still breathing. The four perpetrators lowered them into the hole and covered it with dirt. Over the following days, Tiffany and her co-defendants went on a spending spree, using the Sumners' bank accounts, stealing their identities, and buying clothes, electronics, even fast food. Surveillance footage captured them smiling, laughing, and celebrating their crime. But it didn't last. Within 2 weeks, investigators tracked the group down. All four were arrested. Bruce Nixon, the least involved, agreed to testify against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence. His statements confirmed the unthinkable. The couple had been buried alive. The autopsy would later support that. There were no gunshot wounds, no blunt force trauma, only traces of dirt in the lungs, a harrowing detail that confirmed the Sumners had died slowly, suffocating beneath the soil. Tiffany Cole was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. In court, she sat quietly, often crying, often shaking. Her defense team argued that she had been manipulated by her boyfriend, that she had not physically participated in the burial, that she never intended for anyone to die. But the jury didn't see it that way. They saw a woman who had used her familiarity to gain access, who had knowledge of the plan, and who had driven the vehicle that carried the victims to their final resting place. In 2007, Tiffany Cole was sentenced to death, making her one of only a few women on Florida's death row. In 2022, her sentence was commuted to life without the possibility of parole. What makes this case so disturbing is not just the cruelty of the act, but the calculation behind it. There was no rage, no moment of passion, just a cold, methodical betrayal, a young woman who turned on the very people who had shown her kindness. There's a quiet horror in that, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating crimes don't come from strangers, but from those invited into our lives. Reggie and Carol Sumner didn't stand a chance, but their story endures as a cautionary tale of misplaced trust, of greed unchecked, and of how evil can sometimes arrive with a familiar face and a borrowed smile. Jennifer Mee, nickname the Hiccup Girl. On the night of October 23, 2010, in St. Petersburg, Florida, a 22-year-old man named Shannon Griffin was found lying face down in the grass. He had been shot multiple times. His wallet and phone were missing, and there were no witnesses. The street was quiet. No cameras. No clear signs of a struggle. At first glance, it looked like a random robbery gone wrong. But within hours, police began tracking his final phone calls, and they led them straight to a name that had once been known across the country for something far more innocent: Jennifer Mee. Years earlier, Jennifer had captured national attention for a bizarre and rare medical condition, an uncontrollable case of hiccups. At age 15, she was known as the Hiccup Girl, appearing on morning talk shows and news segments. She was wide-eyed, sweet-faced, and seemingly overwhelmed by the sudden fame. Her hiccups, at one point, were said to reach up to 50 times per minute. Her story captivated viewers. But what no one could have predicted was how quickly things would unravel once the cameras were turned off. By the time Jennifer turned 19, the hiccups had stopped. But something else had started. She was living in a different part of town, running with a different crowd. Her appearance had changed, too, the soft-spoken teenager replaced by someone harder, colder, emotionally distant. She had dropped out of school, moved out of her family home, and begun drifting. On the night of Shannon Griffin's death, Jennifer was the one who had lured him to the area. They had met online, through a dating app. She invited him to meet up, but it wasn't a date, it was a setup. Waiting in the shadows were 2 men, Laren Rayford and Lamont Newton, both friends of Jennifer's. According to police reports and trial testimony, the plan was to rob Shannon, take his money, maybe his car. But the robbery turned violent. Shannon resisted. One of the men pulled out a weapon and fired multiple times. By the time officers arrived, Shannon was already gone. Jennifer claimed she never pulled the trigger. That much was true. But in Florida, the law doesn't always differentiate between the person who carries out the act and the one who orchestrates it. Jennifer had planned the meeting. She'd sent the messages. She brought Shannon to that street, and that made her just as responsible. At trial, the defense argued that Jennifer was easily manipulated, that her past trauma, mental health struggles, and neurological history made her vulnerable. They pointed to her fame as a teenager, suggesting it had distorted her reality and left her open to exploitation. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They focused on her choices, deliberate and premeditated. They emphasized the text messages, the timing, and the fact that Jennifer stayed nearby during the crime. She didn't run. She didn't call for help. The jury deliberated for just a few hours. Jennifer Mee was convicted of first-degree felony murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, the story felt surreal. A girl once known for a harmless medical quirk, someone who had smiled on national TV and been embraced by the public, had become part of something unimaginably dark. The transition was hard to reconcile. What happened in those 4 years? What changed? And why? Some believe Jennifer's case is a cautionary tale about neglected mental health. Others see it as a stark reminder of how easily someone can fall, how quickly a seemingly ordinary life can unravel under pressure, poverty, or poor choices. But perhaps the most haunting part is this. If you watch old clips of Jennifer as a teenager, hiccuping, smiling, giggling nervously on camera, you're looking at someone completely unrecognizable from the woman who now sits behind bars. Not just in appearance, but in presence. The spark is gone, and yet the consequences remain. Shannon Griffin's family was left shattered. A young man with hopes, dreams, and loved ones, gone over what amounted to a few stolen items and a staged meeting. Jennifer may not have pulled the trigger, but her action set everything in motion. In the end, it's not just a story of a crime, but of lost potential on all sides. A young man's life ended. A young woman's future erased, all because of a plan that never should have happened. Some stories fade from the headlines. This one lingers, not because of how it began, but because of how far it fell. Catherine Pelgi. On the morning of June 15, 2011, inside a luxury home in Fort Lauderdale's upscale Las Olas neighborhood, police discovered the lifeless body of 70-year-old Ronald Vinci. The scene was brutal. He had been shot, stabbed, bludgeoned. There were signs of a struggle and a failed attempt to clean up. The horror wasn't just in what had happened, but in who had done it. The woman responsible was someone close, someone he trusted, someone who, just days earlier, had been living under the same roof. Her name was Catherine Pelgi. To most outsiders, Catherine was poised, articulate, and intelligent. She was in her 50s, well-kept, and often seen alongside Ron in social circles. The two had been in an on-again, off-again relationship for several years. Ron was a wealthy aviation executive, a millionaire who owned multiple properties and a vintage car collection. Catherine, though never married to him, had occupied a strange space, not quite a partner, not quite a guest, but always there. Publicly, she came off as reserved, almost elegant. To their neighbors, she was simply Ron's companion. But beneath the calm exterior, things had been unraveling for a long time. By 2011, their relationship had grown increasingly toxic. Ron, by most accounts, was preparing to move on, possibly with a new partner. He had allegedly made plans to have Catherine leave the house and sever ties. It was this impending separation that seemed to light the fuse. On the night of the crime, Catherine and Ron had argued. Exactly what was said remains unknown. What is clear is that something in Catherine broke. Investigators later reconstructed the sequence of events. Catherine first fired a weapon, striking Ron. But that wasn't all. She then stabbed him repeatedly, and then she used a hammer. It wasn't a momentary lapse. It was prolonged, personal, intimate in the most horrific sense. What followed was equally unsettling. Catherine didn't immediately call for help. Instead, she attempted to clean the scene, moving the body, and even placing it inside a plastic-lined storage container. At one point, she drove away from the house, leaving Ron's remains behind. Days later, she was arrested in Key West. She was alone, disoriented, and showing signs of deep psychological distress. At trial, the defense painted Catherine as a woman in emotional collapse, pushed to the brink by betrayal, humiliation, and mental illness. They claimed she had suffered from a breakdown, triggered by years of instability in the relationship and her increasing isolation from friends and family. But the prosecution focused on intent. They showed that Catherine had taken steps before and after the act that indicated premeditation. She tried to hide the evidence. She left town, and despite her claims of despair, she never once reported what had happened. In 2013, Catherine Pelgi was convicted of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The case was not one of sudden chaos or outside danger. It was something much harder to make peace with, a tragedy born in silence behind closed doors between two people who once claimed to care for each other. What makes this case so difficult to understand is how private it all was. No major warning signs, no public outbursts, just a slow, quiet disintegration that ended in violence. Ronald Vinci's life, built over decades, ended in a moment that no one saw coming, and Catherine, a woman who once moved through his world like a shadow, now sits alone, serving a sentence that stretches deep into her old age. There's no satisfaction in how the story ends, no justice that truly balances what was lost. Just two lives, deeply entangled, both ultimately destroyed. And sometimes, that's the hardest kind of crime to understand. Not the ones committed by strangers, but the ones carried out by someone close, someone known, someone trusted. Mary Rice. On February 3, 2017, authorities in Florida and Alabama were in crisis mode. Over the course of just a few days, 4 women had been found dead, all under eerily similar circumstances. Shot in their homes, their vehicles missing. The crimes weren't isolated. They were connected, and a manhunt was already underway for one man, William "Billy" Boyette. But what stunned many wasn't just the brutality of the crimes. It was who was with him. Her name was Mary Rice. To most who knew her, Mary appeared unremarkable. In her late 30s, soft-spoken, with a quiet demeanor. She had previously worked in a school cafeteria and had no significant criminal record. On the surface, she blended in, the kind of woman you'd pass at the grocery store and never notice again. No one expected she would become a key figure in a multi-state killing spree. Mary had known Billy Boyette for years, but by early 2017, their bond had become more intense and more dangerous. Boyette, already a convicted felon with a violent past, had spiraled into paranoia and aggression, and Mary, for reasons still debated to this day, followed him. The spree began on January 31st. Alicia Greer and Jacqueline Moore, 2 women who had connections to Boyette, were found unalived in a motel room in Milton, Florida. What started as a missing persons case quickly escalated once their bodies were discovered. Boyette was named as the suspect. Mary Rice was with him. In the following days, the pair were on the run, and they weren't just hiding. They were hunting. On February the 3rd, 52-year-old Kayla Crocker was shot inside her own home in Florida. Her car was stolen. Her 2-year-old son was left behind, physically unharmed. Kayla would later pass away from her injuries. By then, the suspects were already out of state, driving her stolen vehicle. Throughout the pursuit, Mary Rice had countless opportunities to walk away, to turn herself in, but she didn't. She helped Boyette switch vehicles, she bought supplies, and she was even caught on surveillance footage entering stores. She wasn't just along for the ride. She was helping him survive. Law enforcement agencies across Florida and Alabama coordinated efforts in one of the largest manhunts the region had seen in years. Tips poured in, but the duo always seemed one step ahead, hiding in wooded areas, stealing new vehicles, and threatening anyone who got in their way. On February 7th, their trail ended in West Point, Georgia. After a brief standoff with police, Boyette took his own life. Mary Rice surrendered. The aftermath raised questions that still linger today. Was Mary Rice a willing accomplice, or a woman too afraid to leave? Was she manipulated, or did she make conscious choices at every turn? At trial, prosecutors presented a clear picture. Mary had participated, even if she didn't pull the trigger. Her actions prolonged the spree. Her silence cost lives. They described her as calculating, someone who knew the consequences and chose to help anyway. Her defense painted a different portrait, one of control, of fear. They argued that Boyette was abusive and dangerous, and that Mary was too frightened to break away. Ultimately, the jury sided with the prosecution. Mary Rice was convicted on multiple charges, including accessory to murder, armed robbery, and theft. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. It's difficult to categorize this case neatly. Mary wasn't the one holding the weapon when lives were taken, but she helped make it possible. Her choices, passive or active, had consequences that can't be undone. The families of the victims still grieve. The scars left behind weren't just physical, but psychological. Sometimes evil is loud. It announces itself. But other times it moves quietly, in the silence of the person standing nearby, who watches, who knows, and who still chooses to stay. Mary Rice stood beside the man pulling the trigger, and in that silence, she became part of the story, a chapter of pain, fear, and loss that still haunts the Gulf Coast. Sarah Boone. It was February 25, 2020, when deputies in Winter Park, Florida, responded to an unusual 911 call. Sarah Boone told the dispatcher that her boyfriend was dead, inside a suitcase. She sounded distraught, confused, and insisted it had been a tragic accident. But within hours, the story would unravel into something darker, more deliberate, something captured on video. Sarah Boone was 42 years old, a former real estate agent with no prior violent history. Neighbors described her as quiet, friendly, often seen walking her dog. She had a son from a previous relationship and, to most who knew her, came across as responsible, even if sometimes private. Her partner, Jorge Torres Jr., was 42 as well. Their relationship, according to police reports and neighbors, was complicated, at times affectionate, at other times volatile. Both had previous arrests related to domestic disputes, and both had filed restraining orders against each other over the years. But despite the turbulence, they stayed together. On that February night, Sarah later claimed they had been drinking and decided to play a game. Hide and seek, she said. Inexplicably, Jorge got into a large suitcase. She zipped it closed and said she went upstairs to bed, thinking he would be fine. When she woke the next morning and found him unresponsive, she called 911. But investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. Her story didn't make sense. And when they checked her phone, they found two videos that changed everything. The footage was disturbing. In one clip, Jorge can be heard struggling inside the suitcase, crying out, "I can't breathe." Sarah's voice responds coldly, "Yeah, that's what you do to me when you choke me." She then laughs, "That's on you. Oh, that's what I feel like when you cheat on me." She continues recording. Jorge continues begging, and Sarah does nothing to help him. This wasn't a game. It was a slow, conscious decision to ignore a human being suffering, to film it, to speak over it, and then to walk away. When confronted with the footage, Sarah changed her story. She said she was intoxicated, that she didn't remember recording the videos, that she never meant to harm him. But the prosecution argued something different. They said it was premeditated. If not in planning, then certainly in the moment. She had time, she had clarity, and she made a decision. The case dragged on for years due to delays, legal motions, and the pandemic. But in 2024, Sarah Boone stood trial for second-degree murder. The videos were played in court. The room reportedly fell silent as jurors listened to Jorge's final words, trapped, pleading, dying. Sarah took the stand in her own defense. She cried. She said she felt guilt, that she never thought he was truly in danger. But under cross-examination, prosecutors pointed to her laughter, her comments, her lack of action. Not just in the moment, but hours later, when she went to bed and left him there. In the end, the jury convicted her. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What makes this case so difficult to comprehend is how ordinary the people involved seemed. No grand motives, no elaborate plot. Just a relationship filled with wounds, emotional and physical, that neither person truly escaped. A history of pain that ended in an act of silence. It's easy to ask how someone could do this, how a person could sit back and watch another suffocate. But perhaps the deeper question is how something like this builds, day after day, fight after fight, until one moment crosses the line and there is no coming back. Sarah Boone now lives the rest of her life behind bars. Jorge Torres Jr. never or got the chance to leave the suitcase, or that relationship. His final words weren't heard by someone who wanted to help. They were recorded and played back in a courtroom as evidence of a life taken in the quietest, most horrifying way. There are no answers that satisfy this story, only questions that sit with us long after the screen goes dark. Susan Lawrence. It was June 2, 2023, in Ocala, Florida. A quiet Friday evening in a working-class neighborhood. Families were settling in for the night. Kids played outside. Then, just after 9 p.m., a 911 call shattered the stillness. A woman had been shot, right outside the front door of an apartment. That woman was 35-year-old Ajiki A.J. Owens, a mother of 4. She had come to retrieve her children after a dispute with a neighbor. She never made it back home. The shooter was Susan Lawrence, a 58-year-old white woman who lived just across the small grassy courtyard. When deputies arrived, Lawrence claimed she had acted out of fear, that she was protecting herself. But within hours, the story unfolding wasn't about a sudden act of panic. It was about something that had been building, a slow, bitter feud that had now ended in tragedy. Publicly, Susan Lawrence might have seemed unremarkable. Neighbors described her as reserved, sometimes difficult. She lived alone, had health issues, and often kept to herself. But to several in the community, particularly families of color, she was known for something else. Frequent complaints, confrontations, and verbal hostility, especially toward children. Ajik Owens, on the other hand, was known as a devoted mother. She worked hard, took care of her 4 children, and tried to maintain peace despite rising tensions with Lawrence. But for months, their relationship had deteriorated. It started with noise complaints, then escalated to accusations. At times, the children felt unwelcome, even harassed. On that day, one of Ajik's children accidentally left an iPad on the grass near Lawrence's home. According to witnesses, Susan picked it up and threw it at the child. That's when Ajik came to her door, to confront her, to demand an explanation, perhaps simply to retrieve what had been taken. Susan didn't open the door. She didn't speak. She raised a firearm and fired a single shot through the closed door. The bullet struck Ajik in the chest. She collapsed outside, in front of her child. Paramedics couldn't save her. In the hours after the shooting, Lawrence told law enforcement that she was scared, that she believed Ajiki was going to break down the door, that she had been in fear for her life. Florida's Stand Your Ground laws, which allow the use of deadly force without retreat, loomed heavily over the legal discussion. But there were complications. Ajiki was unarmed. She never entered the home, and neighbors disputed Lawrence's claims, saying she had instigated confrontations in the past, often with racial overtones. One child even reported being called a racial slur just days earlier. The case sparked national outrage. Vigils were held. Civil rights leaders demanded justice. Many saw it not just as a neighbor dispute gone wrong, but as a reflection of deeper fractures about race, fear, and what it means to feel threatened in America. Prosecutors eventually charged Susan Lawrence with manslaughter, not murder, a decision that drew both support and criticism. Some believed it was a balanced approach under Florida law. Others felt it fell short of accountability. The trial took place in early 2024. The defense leaned heavily on the fear narrative, that Lawrence had been terrified of Owens, that she had called authorities in the past, that this was a pattern of escalating fear. But the prosecution pointed to the facts: the locked door, the absence of a weapon, the deliberate nature of firing through a barrier. They played 911 recordings. They walked the jury through the months of complaints, the reported verbal threats, the long trail of animosity. And they asked one central question: at what point does fear become a justification to act? And at what point is it a mask? In the end, the jury convicted Susan Lawrence of manslaughter. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The children Ajika Owens left behind, 4 of them, now grow up without their mother, their lives split by a locked door and a single shot. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a slow, building resentment that found its endpoint in irreversible violence. What lingers is the silence that followed. A moment that could have ended in a conversation or a call for help ended in a gunshot, fired not in chaos, but in decision. Ajik knocked. She didn't break in. She didn't scream. She asked for her child, and the door never opened. Judith Hawk. It was a fall morning in November 2003 in Paulding County, Ohio. The emergency call came in just after 8 a.m. A child's voice, shaken, confused, told the dispatcher that his father had been shot. By the time paramedics arrived, 42-year-old Robert Breininger was already gone. He'd been shot in the head while lying on the couch. His 10-year-old son stood nearby, crying. The child said it was an accident. that he had found a gun and it just went off. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no intruder, and no reason to doubt the boy. Authorities ruled it a tragic mishap, a firearm left unsecured, a child too young to understand the consequences. The case was closed. Judith Hawk, Robert's wife, the boy's stepmother, stood quietly in the background as the community mourned. She was seen as calm, composed, even motherly, a woman who had endured a sudden tragedy. She moved forward with quiet grace, raising the boy, tending to affairs, and ultimately collecting Robert's life insurance payout. No one looked too closely, not yet. 10 years passed. Then in 2013, a new investigation reopened the case, and this time the story would unravel. Because the boy, now a young man, had started to remember things differently. What had once felt like an accident now felt like something else entirely. He began to recall conversations, rehearsals, encouragement. Judith, he said, had coached him over and over on how to handle the weapon. She had told him what would happen after, that it was the only way to stop the abuse, that it would be better for both of them. But the abuse, investigators found, had not been at the hands of Robert. It was Judith who had psychologically manipulated the boy, Judith who had twisted his trust, Judith who had turned him into the instrument of her plan. According to prosecutors, Judith wanted her husband gone, not out of fear, but for control, for money, for a clean slate, and the life insurance policy, worth over $500,000, offered motive. But rather than commit the act herself, she used the one person her husband trusted completely, his child. The boy had been only 10. He didn't fully understand the permanence of what he was doing, and for years he lived with the belief that the incident had been his fault. He carried that weight, the guilt, the confusion, into adolescence, never fully knowing what had happened until pieces began to fall into place. When the truth surfaced, it was devastating. In 2013, Judith Hawk was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, child endangerment, and related offenses. The courtroom was silent as prosecutors described how she had coerced a child into committing the unthinkable, and then allowed him to believe for a decade that it had all been his doing. Her defense claimed the memories had been distorted, that he was confused. But the evidence, the insurance trail, the boy's consistent testimony, and newly recovered behavioral evaluations painted a damning picture. It became clear that this was not a spontaneous crime. It had been orchestrated, layered, cold. Judith was convicted on all counts. She is now serving a life sentence, no parole. The boy, no longer a boy, has tried to rebuild his life. His name is protected, his past less so. He grew up believing he had taken his father's life by accident. Then he had to face the fact that he had been used. This was not a case of impulsive violence. It was slow and strategic, the kind of crime that wears the mask of normalcy for years before revealing its shape. From the outside, Judith looked like a caretaker, a grieving widow, a stepmother who stepped up. But behind closed doors, she planted the seed of a crime in a child's mind and made him believe it was his own. What's most haunting is what this boy was denied, not just his father, but the truth, the ability to mourn, to make peace, to move forward. He wasn't just used, he was rewritten. And Judith Hawk didn't pull the trigger, but she aimed it. Florida has seen its share of infamous crimes, but behind the headlines and courtroom verdicts are the women whose actions left deep scars across families, communities, and generations. From calculated manipulation to moments of chilling violence, each of these cases reveals how darkness doesn't always come with warning signs, and how trust can sometimes be the most dangerous weapon of all. These aren't just stories of crime, they're stories of betrayal, of unraveling minds, and of lives stolen too soon. Which state should we cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments. We're watching them all closely. And if you want more stories like these, real, raw, and unflinching, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're just getting started.